Some decisions take less than 10 seconds to make, yet they have the power to change everything that comes afterward. On a cold Monday morning in downtown Chicago, 26-year-old Marcus Carter believed he was riding toward the opportunity he'd spent 2 years praying for. Resting on his lap was an invitation to interview at Brighton Technologies, one of Illinois' fastest-growing companies. To anyone else, it was just another job interview. To Marcus, it meant paying off overdue rent, giving his 12-year-old sister, Emma, a better home, and finally believing his life could change. But just a few miles from the company's headquarters, an elderly woman suddenly collapsed onto the crowded bus. Her groceries spilled across the aisle. Passengers froze. Some looked away. Others complained they were already late for work. Even the driver hesitated. Marcus had only seconds to choose between the future he'd fought so hard to reach, or a complete stranger who might not survive without him. 5 hours later, one of the most powerful CEOs in America would walk into a public hospital asking a single question that would change both of their lives forever. Where's the young man who saved my mother? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Marcus Carter knew what disappointment felt like. At 26, he'd collected more rejection emails than job offers, watched temporary jobs disappear without warning, and stretched every dollar just to keep a roof over his and his younger sister Emma's heads. But he had never stopped believing that one opportunity could change everything. That's why the interview invitation tucked safely inside his leather portfolio meant so much. Brighton Technologies had chosen him for a final interview after hundreds of applications, offering more than just a job. It offered stability, health insurance, and the chance to finally build the life he had promised Emma after losing their parents 7 years earlier. That morning, Emma had carefully straightened the collar of his only navy blue suit before sending him out the door with a smile. "They're going to love you," she'd said. Marcus smiled at the memory as the bus rolled through downtown Chicago. He checked his watch. He was running perfectly on time. In less than 30 minutes, he would be sitting across from the interview panel he'd spent weeks preparing for. He quietly rehearsed his answers one last time, convinced the hardest part of his day would be proving he deserved a chance. He couldn't have been more wrong. As the bus approached another intersection, an elderly woman seated near the front reached down to pick up a paper grocery bag that had tipped onto its side. Before she could lift it, her hand suddenly lost its strength. The bag slipped from her fingers, oranges rolled across the aisle, and her body slowly leaned forward before collapsing heavily onto the floor. At first, nobody moved. Several passengers looked up from their phones, assuming someone else would respond. A young businessman frowned at his watch. An older commuter shook his head impatiently. The driver glanced into the rearview mirror, hesitated for only a moment, and then reached for the radio. In those few silent seconds, Marcus felt something inside him shift. He wasn't thinking about Brighton Technologies anymore. He wasn't thinking about his carefully prepared interview answers or the future he had spent years chasing. He was looking at an elderly woman struggling to breathe, while an entire bus full of strangers waited for someone else to do the right thing. And before anyone realized what he was about to sacrifice, Marcus Carter was already on his feet. Marcus dropped to one knee beside the elderly woman, ignoring the impatient voices rising around him. Her skin had turned unusually pale, and her breathing came in shallow, uneven gasps that told him this was far more serious than a simple fainting spell. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he asked gently, careful not to move her more than necessary. Her eyelids fluttered, but she couldn't answer. One trembling hand reached weakly toward the torn grocery bag lying several feet away before falling back to the floor. Marcus looked around the bus, expecting someone else to kneel beside him, someone with medical experience or at least the willingness to help. Instead, he saw people avoiding eye contact. A few passengers quietly returned to staring at their phones as though pretending nothing unusual was happening would somehow erase their responsibility. One woman shook her head and muttered that she couldn't afford to be late again. Another man complained that an ambulance would block traffic for hours. The words weren't shouted, but Marcus heard every one of them. It wasn't anger he felt. It was disappointment. How had an entire bus full of decent-looking people become so comfortable watching someone suffer? The driver remained seated behind the wheel, one hand gripping the steering column, while speaking hurriedly into his radio. After a few moments, he turned around and announced that emergency responders had been contacted, but because the route was already behind schedule, company policy required him to continue to the next designated stop. The nearest hospital was still several blocks away, and waiting where they were would delay dozens of passengers. His voice carried the tone of someone more concerned about paperwork than a human life. "We'll let her off at the next stop," he said firmly. "The ambulance can meet her there." A wave of uneasy silence settled across the bus. Marcus stared at him in disbelief. "She can't even sit up," he replied. "She needs help now." The driver shrugged. "I'm following instructions." Those 4 words echoed inside Marcus's mind. Following instructions. As though compassion could be replaced by policy. Marcus pulled his phone from his jacket pocket with shaking hands and dialed emergency services himself, giving the dispatcher the bus number, their location, and a description of the woman's condition. The dispatcher instructed him to stay with her, keep her calm if she regained consciousness, and monitor her breathing until paramedics arrived. Every passing second felt painfully slow. Marcus checked the time again. His interview was now less than 25 minutes away. If he left immediately at the next stop, he might still have a chance. It would be close, impossibly close, but perhaps not completely hopeless. He imagined walking into Brighton Technologies out of breath, apologizing for being late, explaining that someone had collapsed in front of him. Surely they would understand. Surely any company worth working for would appreciate honesty and compassion. Then another thought crept into his mind. What if they didn't? What if the receptionist simply crossed his name off the list? What if years of sacrifice disappeared because he chose to stop for someone nobody else cared enough to notice? The bus finally pulled over near a quiet intersection several miles from downtown. There was no hospital in sight, no ambulance waiting, only a nearly empty sidewalk bordered by closed storefronts and a small neighborhood pharmacy across the street. The driver opened the doors and stood, expecting Marcus to help move the elderly woman onto a nearby bench. Marcus looked through the windshield, then back at the woman lying helplessly on the floor. "The ambulance isn't here," he said. "They told me to wait where we were." The driver folded his arms. "Sir, everyone else has places to be." Murmurs of agreement spread through the bus. One passenger even suggested laying the woman on the bench until help arrived. Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. This wasn't an inconvenience. This was someone's mother, someone's grandmother, someone who had woken up that morning expecting an ordinary day, never imagining strangers would debate whether her life was worth delaying their commute. Without saying another word, Marcus slipped one arm beneath the woman's shoulders and the other beneath her knees, lifting her as carefully as he could. She was surprisingly light, and he could feel how fragile she had become. An elderly man near the front finally stood and picked up her scattered groceries before quietly handing them to Marcus. It wasn't much, but it was the first act of kindness anyone besides Marcus had shown. As Marcus stepped off the bus carrying the unconscious woman, the doors closed behind him almost immediately. Through the large windows, he watched dozens of faces staring back at him. Some looked guilty, others looked relieved. Within seconds, the bus pulled away and disappeared into traffic, carrying with it the opportunity Marcus had spent years preparing for. He stood alone on the sidewalk holding a complete stranger, listening to the fading sound of the engine, and for the first time that morning, he realized there was almost no chance he would make it to Brighton Technologies before the interview began. Still, as he looked down at the frightened woman resting in his arms, one thought settled firmly in his heart. Some opportunities could be replaced. A human life never could. Before we continue, what would you have done if you were in Marcus's position? Would you have risked your dream job to help a complete stranger? Let us know in the comments. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this. Marcus laid the elderly woman gently across the wooden bench outside the pharmacy, slipping his folded jacket beneath her head to keep it from resting against the cold metal armrest. Her breathing remained uneven, and although her eyes opened for a brief moment, they seemed unable to focus on anything around her. She whispered something so faintly that Marcus couldn't understand it before closing her eyes again. The grocery bag the elderly man had handed him rested beside the bench. Several oranges were bruised from rolling across the bus floor, a loaf of bread had been crushed beneath someone's shoe, and a carton of eggs had cracked open, slowly dripping through the torn paper. It was such an ordinary collection of groceries that Marcus couldn't stop thinking about it. Whoever this woman was, she'd started her morning worrying about bread, milk, fruit, and eggs, never imagining she'd end it surrounded by strangers. Minutes seemed to stretch into hours. Marcus looked at his watch again. His interview had officially begun. Somewhere inside Brighton Technologies, candidates were probably introducing themselves, shaking hands, answering questions he had practiced for weeks. He imagined the receptionist glancing toward the lobby one last time before quietly crossing his name off the attendance sheet. His phone vibrated. The screen displayed a number he immediately recognized from the interview confirmation email. Brighton Technologies, Human Resources. Marcus stared at it for only a second before answering. "Hello, this is Marcus Carter." A polite woman's voice greeted him. "Mr. Carter, this is Rebecca from Brighton Technologies. We were expecting you 10 minutes ago. Is everything all right?" Marcus looked down at the elderly woman lying unconscious beside him and closed his eyes for a brief moment. He could have invented an excuse. He could have blamed traffic or claimed his bus had broken down. Instead, he chose the truth. "I'm so sorry," he replied. "A woman collapsed on the bus. She didn't have anyone with her, and I couldn't leave." There was silence on the other end before Rebecca responded. "I understand, Mr. Carter, but unfortunately our interview schedule is extremely tight today. We can only wait another 5 minutes." Marcus swallowed hard. He thanked her for calling, apologized once more, and ended the conversation. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. Deep inside, he already knew the opportunity he'd fought so hard to earn was slipping away. The distant sound of sirens finally echoed through the neighborhood. Within moments, an ambulance turned the corner and stopped beside the sidewalk. 2 paramedics hurried out carrying medical equipment, immediately taking over the woman's care. Marcus stepped back to give them room, but remained close enough to answer every question they asked. Had she hit her head? How long had she been unconscious? Did she complain of chest pain? Did anyone know her medical history? Marcus answered honestly. He knew almost nothing about her except that she had boarded the bus carrying groceries and that no one else had been willing to help. One of the paramedics searched carefully through her handbag looking for identification or emergency contact information. Inside they found reading glasses, a small leather wallet, several family photographs, prescription medication, and a worn envelope containing handwritten notes. There was no cell phone, no emergency contact card, no obvious way to notify her family. "We'll keep looking at the hospital," one paramedic said as they carefully lifted her onto the stretcher. "Would you mind riding with us? You're the only witness who knows what happened." Marcus hesitated for just a second. If he left now, perhaps there was still a tiny chance of reaching Brighton Technologies before everyone went home. Then he looked at the woman being loaded into the ambulance, completely alone except for strangers who knew nothing about her life. Without another word, Marcus climbed inside and took the empty seat beside her, unaware that this single decision would soon place him at the center of a story no one inside that ambulance could possibly imagine. The ambulance pulled away from the curb with its lights flashing through the busy Chicago streets, weaving between morning traffic while the steady rhythm of the heart monitor filled the small compartment. Marcus sat quietly, watching the paramedics work with calm precision as they attached sensors, checked the elderly woman's blood pressure, and started an intravenous line. One of them asked Marcus again if he knew her name or where she lived. He wished he had something useful to offer, but all he could do was shake his head. "She collapsed on the bus," he repeated. Nobody seemed to know her. The paramedic nodded, though the concern on his face suggested he had hoped for a different answer. "You'd be surprised," he said while adjusting the oxygen mask over the woman's face. "A lot of people think someone else will step in. Most of the time, nobody does." Marcus looked out the rear window as downtown faded behind them. Somewhere beyond those buildings, his interview was continuing without him. Every mile the ambulance traveled carried him farther away from the future he had imagined only an hour earlier. Yet strangely, he felt no regret, only uncertainty. He had no idea what would happen next, but he knew he couldn't have walked away. When they arrived at Mercy General Hospital, nurses were already waiting with a stretcher. The emergency department moved with practiced efficiency as doctors immediately surrounded the elderly woman, asking rapid questions while pushing her toward the treatment area. Within seconds, she disappeared through a set of swinging doors marked "Authorized Personnel Only." Marcus instinctively took a step forward before a nurse gently stopped him. "We'll take it from here," she said kindly. "Thank you for staying with her." For the first time that morning, Marcus found himself standing completely alone. The adrenaline that had carried him through the chaos began to fade, replaced by exhaustion he hadn't noticed before. He looked down at his suit jacket. One sleeve was stained from where he'd knelt beside the woman on the bus floor. His tie had come loose, and one of his shirt cuffs had torn slightly while lifting her into the ambulance. He almost laughed at the thought of showing up to an interview looking like this. Even if Brighton Technologies had somehow agreed to see him, he no longer resembled the confident professional he had hoped to present. A few minutes later, another nurse approached with a clipboard. "Sir, could you answer a few questions for our records?" Marcus spent the next several minutes describing everything that had happened from the moment the woman boarded the bus until the ambulance arrived. Every detail was carefully written down. The nurse thanked him before asking one final question. "Are you a family member?" Marcus smiled faintly and shook his head. "No, a neighbor?" Again he shook his head. "Then how do you know her?" Marcus looked toward the emergency room doors before quietly answering. "I don't. I just happened to be there." The nurse paused for a moment, studying him with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. It wasn't surprise. It was admiration mixed with disbelief. "Most people would have left after calling for help," she admitted softly. "You stayed." Marcus shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. It didn't feel right to leave her alone. The nurse smiled before returning to her work, but her words lingered in Marcus's mind. He hadn't stayed because he expected gratitude or recognition. In fact, he assumed that once the woman's family arrived, he would quietly leave and continue searching for another job, another interview, another opportunity that might never come. His phone buzzed again, pulling him back to reality. The screen displayed a new email notification from Brighton Technologies. Marcus hesitated before opening it. The message was brief, professional, and exactly what he had feared. It thanked him for his interest in the position and explained that because he had failed to appear for his scheduled interview, the company had decided to move forward with other candidates. They wished him success in his future endeavors. Marcus stared at the words for several seconds before locking his phone and slipping it back into his pocket. The interview was over. The dream he had carried for so many months had ended with a single email that would never mention the reason he wasn't there. He leaned back in the waiting room chair and slowly exhaled, trying to convince himself that he would find another opportunity someday. But even as he repeated those words silently, they felt difficult to believe. Jobs like Brighton Technologies didn't come along often, especially for someone with gaps in employment and responsibilities waiting at home. He thought about Emma. She would be expecting a phone call filled with excitement, eager to hear every detail of the interview. Instead, he would have to tell her that he never made it through the front doors. He dreaded the disappointment she might try to hide behind one of her encouraging smiles. As he lowered his head into his hands, he failed to notice a doctor walking briskly toward the nurse's station carrying the elderly woman's medical chart. After reviewing several pages, the doctor looked up and asked a question that immediately changed the mood of everyone nearby. "Has anyone reached her emergency contact yet?" One nurse shook her head. "Not yet, doctor. We found a name in her records, but the number kept going straight to voicemail." The doctor frowned. "Keep trying. Her son needs to know immediately." None of them realized that, within the next few hours, that phone call would bring someone to Mercy General Hospital whose arrival would leave every person in the waiting room wondering who the quiet young man in the wrinkled navy suit really was. The nurse tried the number one last time. This time, someone answered. She quickly introduced herself and confirmed she was speaking with Daniel Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore, your mother was brought to Mercy General Hospital after collapsing on a city bus. She's stable, but the doctor would like you here as soon as possible." After a brief pause, she nodded. "We'll be expecting you." Hanging up, she turned to the doctor. "He's on his way." The doctor breathed a quiet sigh of relief before returning to the emergency room. Across the waiting area, Marcus barely noticed. He assumed another family had simply been notified. About 45 minutes later, the atmosphere inside the hospital changed. Nurses exchanged hurried glances. Security officers moved toward the entrance. Outside, a convoy of black SUVs rolled beneath the emergency canopy. Several sharply dressed executives stepped out before opening the rear door of the lead vehicle. A tall man in a charcoal gray suit emerged and walked briskly toward the hospital. He didn't look like one of Chicago's most powerful CEOs. He looked like a son desperate to see his mother. "Mr. Whitmore," the nurse called as she hurried toward him. "I'm Dr. Collins," the physician said, extending his hand. Daniel Whitmore shook it briefly before asking the only question that mattered. "Is she alive?" The doctor's answer came without hesitation. "Yes, she's stable. We believe she suffered a cardiac episode triggered by exhaustion and dehydration. Fortunately, she received help quickly." Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment, releasing a breath he hadn't realized he was holding during the drive across the city. "Can I see her?" he asked. "In just a moment," Dr. Collins replied. "There is something you should know first." Daniel looked up, sensing there was more to the story. The doctor explained how dozens of passengers had remained seated after his mother collapsed, how emergency services had been delayed, and how one complete stranger refused to leave her side from the bus until she reached the hospital. "He stayed here the entire time," Dr. Collins said. "Without him, things could have turned out very differently." Daniel listened without interrupting. Every sentence seemed harder to hear than the one before it. He couldn't understand how his mother had been surrounded by people and yet left almost completely alone. Then the doctor pointed quietly across the waiting room. Marcus sat with his elbows resting on his knees, staring absent-mindedly at the floor, completely unaware that the conversation concerned him. His interview folder leaned against the chair beside him, its edges slightly bent from the long morning. Daniel followed the doctor's gaze before asking softly, "That's him?" The doctor nodded. He never asked for recognition. In fact, I don't think he expected anyone to thank him. Daniel looked at Marcus for several seconds before walking slowly across the waiting room. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No cameras, no applause, just two strangers whose lives had crossed because one had decided another human being mattered more than his own plans. Marcus noticed someone approaching and instinctively stood. Before he could introduce himself, Daniel extended his hand. "I'm Daniel Whitmore." Marcus shook it politely. "Marcus Carter." Daniel's voice carried genuine emotion. "The doctors told me everything you did for my mother today." Marcus immediately shook his head. "I really didn't do anything special. She needed help." Daniel smiled faintly. "From what I understand, everyone else disagreed." Marcus didn't know how to answer that. He wasn't interested in criticizing strangers. He simply replied, "People panic. Sometimes they don't know what to do." Daniel studied him carefully. Most people, when meeting someone they recognized from television or business magazines, reacted with excitement. Marcus didn't seem to recognize him at all. There was no attempt to impress him, no request for a photograph, no mention of his company. Only quiet humility. It was unusual, refreshing, even. "I'd like to thank you properly," Daniel said. Marcus quickly raised a hand. "There's really no need, sir. I'm just glad she's all right." Daniel glanced toward the handbag resting on the chair. "You've been looking after her belongings too?" Marcus nodded. "The nurses asked me to hold on to them until family arrived." Daniel picked up the worn grocery bag lying beside it. The broken carton of eggs, bruised fruit, and crushed loaf of bread brought a painful smile to his face. "She insists on doing her own shopping," he said quietly. "No matter how many times I offer to send someone." Marcus looked surprised. "She lives alone?" Daniel nodded. "By choice. My mother has always believed independence is something you protect for as long as you can." His eyes drifted toward the emergency room doors. "She's also incredibly stubborn." For the first time that afternoon, Marcus allowed himself to ask the question that had been lingering in his mind. "Is she going to be okay?" Daniel looked at the doctor before answering. "Thanks to you. I believe she will." There was another brief silence before Daniel noticed the navy blue interview folder leaning against Marcus's chair. The company logo printed neatly across the front immediately caught his attention. Brighton Technologies. His expression changed almost instantly. He reached down and gently picked up the folder, reading Marcus's name printed beneath the interview confirmation letter tucked inside the transparent sleeve. He looked back at Marcus, confusion replacing gratitude. "You interviewed with Brighton today?" Marcus hesitated before answering. "I was supposed to." Daniel frowned. "Supposed to?" Marcus smiled politely, though there was unmistakable disappointment behind it. "I never made it." Daniel slowly lowered the folder. He knew today's interview schedule by heart. Earlier that morning, his executive assistant had mentioned one candidate who simply never arrived. Human Resources had already marked the applicant as a no-show and removed his resume from consideration. Daniel looked from the folder to Marcus and back again, suddenly realizing something that made the entire room seem unusually quiet. The young man standing in front of him hadn't merely sacrificed a morning. He had unknowingly sacrificed an opportunity at Daniel's own company to save the life of Daniel's mother. Daniel didn't speak for several long seconds. Instead, he turned toward his executive assistant, who had remained respectfully in the background throughout the conversation. "Rebecca," he said calmly, "would you please bring me today's interview schedule and Marcus Carter's application file?" Daniel's assistant disappeared down the hallway, leaving Marcus standing in complete confusion. He still had no idea who Daniel Whitmore really was. The name sounded familiar, but his thoughts had been consumed by everything that had happened since stepping off the bus. He assumed Daniel was simply another concerned family member with enough influence to move quickly through hospital procedures. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, "I appreciate your kindness, but there really isn't anything to look into. I missed the interview. That was my responsibility." Daniel looked directly at him before answering. "Marcus, there are moments in life when responsibility and character are tested at the same time. Today, yours was." Before Marcus could respond, Rebecca returned carrying a leather portfolio and a tablet containing the morning's interview schedule. Daniel opened the file and immediately found Marcus's application. He read silently for several moments. A bachelor's degree earned with honors. Excellent references from previous supervisors. Months of unemployment explained only by temporary layoffs and caring for his younger sister after the loss of their parents. There were no complaints from former employers. No disciplinary records. No shortcuts. Just the story of a young man who kept trying despite doors repeatedly closing in front of him. Daniel slowly closed the folder. "Mr. Carter," he said, "do you know who I am?" Marcus shook his head honestly. "No, sir." Daniel almost smiled. It had been years since someone had answered that question without embarrassment or pretending otherwise. "I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Brighton Technologies." Marcus stared at him for several seconds, convinced he had misunderstood. His eyes instinctively shifted toward the company logo on the folder, then back to Daniel's face. Everything suddenly made sense. The executives who had arrived together. The security outside. The respect every member of the hospital staff had shown him. Marcus felt the weight of what he'd just heard settle over him. He began quietly before stopping himself. Daniel nodded. "Yes." Marcus looked down at the folder still resting in Daniel's hands. "Then I suppose you already know I didn't show up." Daniel answered with complete honesty. "I knew someone named Marcus Carter missed today's interview. I had no idea that same man spent his morning saving my mother's life." Marcus lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry for missing it." Daniel immediately interrupted him. "Why are you apologizing?" Marcus looked surprised by the question. "Because your company gave me an opportunity, and I wasn't there." Daniel folded his arms thoughtfully. "If I had been sitting on that bus this morning and my mother collapsed, what would you have wanted me to do?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "Help her, even if it meant missing an important meeting?" "Of course." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then why do you believe I would expect less from you?" Marcus had no answer. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective. Daniel had spent decades interviewing talented people. He had met graduates from prestigious universities, executives with remarkable resumes, and candidates who knew exactly how to impress an interview panel. Yet standing before him was someone who had unknowingly demonstrated qualities that no interview question could ever fully measure. Compassion couldn't be rehearsed. Integrity couldn't be memorized. Character revealed itself only when no one was watching. Rebecca quietly leaned toward Daniel. "Sir, Human Resources has officially closed today's interview process." Daniel looked at her for a moment before asking a simple question. "Does our policy prevent us from interviewing an applicant who missed an interview because he accompanied a stranger to the emergency room?" Rebecca glanced through the employee handbook displayed on her tablet before answering. "No, sir. The policy allows exceptions under extraordinary circumstances if approved by executive leadership." Daniel smiled faintly. "Good." Turning back toward Marcus, he gestured toward a small family consultation room located just beyond the waiting area. "Would you mind giving me 30 minutes? Marcus blinked in confusion. "For what?" Daniel replied. "For the interview you thought you'd lost." Marcus looked around the hospital corridor, almost expecting someone to explain that this had all become some elaborate misunderstanding. "Here," he finally asked. Daniel nodded. "Right here." Within minutes, a conference table usually reserved for doctors meeting with families became an interview room unlike any Marcus had ever imagined. There were no polished corporate walls, no panoramic views of the city skyline, no carefully arranged refreshments waiting for candidates. Instead, there was a modest table, 4 chairs, a pitcher of water, and a window overlooking the hospital parking lot. Daniel sat opposite Marcus, joined by Rebecca and the company's director of operations, who had arrived after receiving an urgent phone call. Marcus adjusted his wrinkled tie, clearly embarrassed by his appearance. Daniel noticed immediately. "Forget the suit," he said. "I'm far more interested in the man wearing it." The interview began with familiar questions about Marcus's education, previous employment, and career goals. Marcus answered each one calmly and honestly, never attempting to exaggerate his accomplishments. When he didn't know something, he admitted it. When discussing challenges in his past, he accepted responsibility rather than blaming circumstances. After nearly 20 minutes, Daniel quietly closed the resume. "I'd like to ask one final question," he said. "It's the only one that really matters." Marcus nodded. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Imagine everything that happened today happens again tomorrow. Same bus, same woman, same interview. This time you know exactly what the decision will cost you. You know you'll lose the opportunity. You know your sister will be disappointed. You know months of searching will begin all over again. Knowing all of that, would you still step off the bus?" Marcus didn't even pause to think. "Yes." Daniel studied him carefully. "Why?" Marcus answered with the same quiet sincerity that had guided him all morning. "Because if I walked away to protect my future, I'd have to spend the rest of my life remembering the person I became to get there. I don't think any job is worth that." No one spoke for several seconds. Rebecca lowered her pen. The director of operations quietly leaned back in his chair. Daniel simply smiled. It wasn't the smile of a businessman who had found another employee. It was the smile of a son who had just met the stranger responsible for giving him another chance to hug his mother. "Thank you," he said softly. Marcus looked confused. "For what?" Daniel replied. "For reminding me that the values our company writes on conference room walls still exist in real people." He stood, walked around the table, and extended his hand once more. "Marcus Carter, on behalf of Brighton Technologies, I'd like to offer you the position of Junior Operations Analyst. Your employment won't begin because you saved my mother's life. It will begin because today you demonstrated the exact character we hope every employee possesses." The interview simply confirmed what your actions had already revealed. Marcus stared at him in disbelief. "Are you serious?" Daniel nodded. "Very." Marcus felt his eyes begin to fill with tears he had spent years teaching himself to hide. He accepted Daniel's hand, unable to find words. Every rejection email, every temporary job, every sleepless night wondering how he would care for Emma, every disappointment that had convinced him success belonged to someone else. It all seemed to collapse into that single moment. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and handed Marcus a business card. "Report Monday morning," he said. "Human Resources will complete the paperwork tomorrow." Before Marcus could thank him again, the emergency room doors opened. Dr. Collins stepped into the hallway with a smile that immediately caught Daniel's attention. "She's awake," he said. Daniel hurried toward his mother's room, then stopped after only a few steps and looked back at Marcus. "Would you come with me?" Marcus hesitated. "I don't want to intrude." "You're not intruding," Daniel replied. "You're family to her now, whether she realizes it yet or not." The elderly woman looked tired but peaceful as Daniel entered the room. The moment she saw her son, tears formed in her eyes. He leaned down carefully and embraced her, neither of them speaking for several seconds. Finally, she looked past him and noticed Marcus standing quietly near the doorway. She smiled warmly despite her obvious exhaustion. "There you are," she whispered. Marcus stepped closer. "How are you feeling?" She reached for his hand. "Better? Thanks to you." Daniel gently explained everything that had happened after she lost consciousness. She listened quietly before looking back at Marcus with tears slowly rolling down her cheeks. "You stayed?" she asked. Marcus shrugged modestly. "I couldn't leave you alone." She squeezed his hand a little tighter. "Most people don't stop anymore." Marcus smiled softly. "Someone once stopped for my family when we needed help. I guess today was my turn." After a few moments, Marcus finally asked the question that had been on his mind since seeing Daniel arrive. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded. "Why do you still ride the city bus?" Daniel laughed gently. "I've been asking her that for years." The elderly woman looked toward the hospital window before answering. "When my husband and I built our first business, we had almost nothing. We rode buses every day because we couldn't afford anything else. After the company grew, everyone expected me to hide behind chauffeurs and private cars. But I realized something. The further people rise in life, the easier it becomes to forget the people still standing where you once stood. Riding the bus reminds me where I came from. It reminds me to see people instead of titles. This morning, I saw hundreds of faces, but only one heart willing to stop." Her eyes returned to Marcus. Never let success change that. 6 months passed. Winter slowly gave way to spring, and life looked remarkably different for everyone involved. Marcus had become one of the most respected young employees at Brighton Technologies. Not because anyone treated him differently, but because he approached every assignment with the same integrity he had shown that Monday morning. He arrived early, volunteered for difficult projects, admitted mistakes honestly, and quietly earned the trust of colleagues twice his age. Daniel never gave him special treatment. In fact, he often expected more from Marcus than anyone else. Believing genuine respect meant holding people to the highest standard rather than the easiest one. At home, Emma finally had the stability her brother had dreamed of providing. Their overdue bills disappeared one by one. She transferred into a better school, joined the science club she'd always wanted to attend, and often joked that Marcus smiled far more than he used to. The small apartment still wasn't luxurious, but it was filled with something it had lacked for years: peace. On weekends, Marcus occasionally visited Daniel's mother, who insisted on baking far more cookies than any visitor could possibly eat. She never stopped riding public transportation, though Daniel quietly convinced her to carry a mobile phone at all times. She laughed every time he reminded her. One afternoon, during a company leadership meeting, Daniel stood before hundreds of employees and shared a story without mentioning Marcus by name. He spoke about values, about character, and about the difference between success and significance. "Skills can be taught," he told them. "Experience can be gained. But integrity reveals itself long before anyone offers you a promotion. Sometimes the most important interview you'll ever attend isn't held in a boardroom. Sometimes it happens when nobody is watching." Marcus listened from the back of the room, knowing those words had very little to do with business and everything to do with life. The truth is, opportunities don't always arrive wearing expensive suits or carrying impressive titles. Sometimes they arrive disguised as impossible choices. Sometimes they ask you to risk something precious for someone you've never met. On that Monday morning, Marcus Carter believed he was sacrificing his future when he stepped off a city bus to help a stranger. In reality, he wasn't losing the opportunity of a lifetime. He was revealing the kind of man worthy of receiving one. His greatest qualification wasn't printed on a resume. It was written in the decision he made when everyone else chose to look away. And perhaps that's the lesson worth remembering long after this story ends. Success may open doors, but character determines what happens after you walk through them. So if you had been sitting on that bus that morning, knowing it might cost you your dream job, would you have stepped forward to help, or would you have stayed in your seat? Let us know your answer in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.